Good morning. I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche Organization with your daily video update for May 24th, 2022. Perhaps you've seen some of the coverage of the ongoing trial in Washington, D.C. of Clinton campaign attorney Michael Sussman. And I will have an update on that, as it's quite interesting, as the testimony so far has demonstrated, as we had been reporting all along, that the whole of Russiagate was a fraud, was a fabricated story designed to prevent any relationship between the United States and Russia during the Trump presidency. So I'll come to that in a moment. But I have a couple of headlines that are quite significant in themselves. Let's start with the opening of the World Economic Forum conference in Davos, Switzerland yesterday. The initial address was given by Ukrainian puppet President Zelensky. And he spoke to an adoring audience of oligarchs with a praiseworthy, or not praiseworthy, but a praise coming from Klaus Schwab in his introduction. Now, he called for more war. He thanked them, but then bitterly complained they're not doing enough to help Ukraine. He said, we need billions of dollars in reconstruction aid, billions of dollars a month. He called for billions of dollars in additional weapons and military aid. Ukraine has already used up 3 years of production of Javelin anti-missile weapons, or anti-tank weapons. So where is this going to come from, this military aid? And then he called for the complete and total isolation of Russia. No trade, bar all Russian banks from financial system, a complete oil embargo, and more sanctions. Now, while he was speaking, Ukraine's chief negotiator, Podolyak, said that Ukraine is not negotiating to end the war, nor to achieve a ceasefire. Perhaps you've seen the videos from the Russians that showed the Azov militia members who they captured in Mariupol. It's quite revealing. They had them take off their shirts, and what it showed is tattoos of Hitler's ally Bandera, of swastikas, of the Black Sun insignia, which we saw recently in the Buffalo shooter. And yet there's still a cover-up that these Nazi fighters are being portrayed as heroic freedom fighters. But they're really hardcore Nazis, and this is reminiscent of calling the ISIS and Al-Qaeda fighters in Syria moderate rebels. Now, secondly, we have Biden's trip to Asia. And besides the usual bungles and stumbles that he made, there's actually quite a bit of importance here, and I'll cover it much more detail tomorrow. But the first meeting was to put together something called the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. Now, this is supposedly a trade deal, but it has nothing to do with trade, has nothing to do with production. It's all about cutting off China from the world economically. It's to do with China what's being done now with Russia, economic warfare. But despite all the hoopla, there are no agreements yet. In fact, The Hill described it as, quote, collective discussions toward future negotiations. In other words, a nothing burger. No agreements have been signed. Many of the countries are hesitant to get involved in an economic war against China. And the question you have to ask is, what's going to replace the goods produced in China in countries like the United States, where we still have no viable plans to upgrade industrial manufacturing? Now, then the next meeting is of the so-called Quad, and this is India, US, Japan, and Australia. It's really a seed crystal for an Asian NATO. And Biden, in the process of discussing this, was asked a question about US policy toward China, and he said, if China makes a move on Taiwan, the US will get involved militarily. Now, does this mean the US is prepared for a two-front war? Because we're not getting out of the Ukraine situation. The US is still heavily committed to that. So I'll have more on the Biden trip to Asia tomorrow, but it's really indicative of what we're seeing in Ukraine, that the United States is being committed by the Biden administration and by the Republicans who are supporting the war in Ukraine and want a war against China, such as Rubio and others, that we're being put into a situation of permanent warfare. Now let's go to the Sussman trial. The evidence presented in the last days demonstrate that the Clinton campaign concocted a story of Trump collusion through Alpha Bank, a Russian bank, which they alleged was a connection between Trump and Putin. Now, the crux of the story is there was a September 2016 meeting between Clinton attorney Sussman, who met with FBI General Counsel James Baker. In his testimony on, I think, last Thursday or Friday, Baker said that he viewed this evidence presented to him by Sussman as, quote, a national security threat, unquote. Now, the evidence was completely fraudulent, as the FBI later discovered, that they said there was insufficient evidence to support the allegation that Trump was in touch with Putin and the Russians through Alpha Bank. But Sussman told Baker that the New York Times was going to cover this, and Baker panicked and said in a note back to the FBI, we need to get going on this. Now, Sussman in this meeting never told Baker he was working with the Clinton campaign. But we now know that not only was he working for the Clinton campaign, he billed the Clinton campaign for the time he spent in the meeting with Baker. Now, just so you know, Baker subsequently left the FBI in disgrace and tried to get a job at Sussman's law firm. You know where he is now? He's the Deputy General Counsel for Twitter. Now, the Clinton campaign manager from 2016, Robby Mook, was the next person on the stand. And he made a revealing admission, which is that Hillary Clinton not only was aware that they were getting this story out, but she approved it, taking the fake story of Sussman to the FBI and to the media. Now, on October 31st, 2016, Slate, a magazine, covered the story. And Hillary Clinton put out a release. The campaign put out a press release on this, in which they said, quote, this secret hotline, that is the Alpha Bank story, may be the key to unlocking the mystery of Trump's ties to Russia, unquote. This press release was written by Jake Sullivan, who was an aide to the Clinton campaign at the time. He's now President Biden's national security advisor. They knew there was nothing to this story, but they put it out as an October surprise to try to sink the Trump campaign. After that failed and Trump was elected, they spent the next 3 years doubling down on this story, using the Steele dossier, using one completely fabricated charge after another to try to prevent any positive relationship from developing between the United States and Russia, despite Trump's profession that he intended to be not just friends with Russia, but engaged in cooperation with Russia. So there'll be more coming out on this story as the trial continues. The important point here is that U.S. policy today is a continuation of the lies of the lies of the Russian story in 2016, but it goes back to the 2014 lies about the so-called freedom-loving Ukrainians rebelling against Russia, which was a U.S. regime change coup against Russia. So we're now in the midst of the consequences of an ongoing U.S. policy, which really goes back to the end of the Cold War and the lies when the U.S. told the Russians there would be no eastward expansion of NATO. Think about all of this when you read the stories about what's going on in Ukraine today. Now, we're going to be presenting the true story of what's behind this, the lunacy of politicians. You can use the link at the bottom of the description page to register for our conference on May 26th. And I'd urge you to not just register for yourself, but share the link with your friends. Let's build a big audience, because we need a mobilization not just to expose the lies, but to change the policy of the United States. Thanks for joining me. See you again tomorrow.